It is now 1:15. We will proceed with more questions from Kelp's attorney.
Mr. Chairman, I'm concluded with my cross-examination, so I would
Very
pass it
good.
over to, Mr. Brown.
Very good. Yes, I forgot about that. Yes.
or whoever's here in Mr. Brown's stead, or yourselves.
I don't think anyone is here in his stead. Mr. Hensley, would you like to proceed across?
I believe it's time for the Mr. Chairman, though, and then maybe the MCC could go after that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say to you what Lucas was just about to say to you. I would suggest we wait 3 seconds while Mr. Brown takes off his jacket.
Okay. We are waiting for you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
No questions.
You had a lot of time to think about that. Well done. So now, quick. Okay. Questions now by Commissioner Attorney, Mr. Hamilton.
All right. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think I have hopefully just a few that we can get through this afternoon. First, for clarity, I believe that the integrated resource plan is in the record of this case, but did Northwestern's most recent integrated resource plan include kelp capacity after June 2024 in sort of the baseline of what you assumed moving forward?
Is the question for the unfiled resource plan?
No, your most recently filed resource plan.
Oh, okay. So the 2019 plan. My recollection was it reflected the expiration date of the contract of the facility.
So the facility was not included after June 2024 in your projections?
That's my recollection, subject to check.
Okay. Can you tell me why Northwestern assumed that kelp would no longer provide capacity after June of 2024?
When deciding what to include in the resource stack, in that plan, we would typically have retired a resource at the end of its contract life and not necessarily presumed contract extension.
Okay. Could you explain, I guess, let me back up here. Has Northwestern ever considered being the proactive negotiator and reaching out to kelp in the first instance to see if they would provide additional capacity after June of 2024?
In terms of being the proactive party, I think Northwestern's thought is simply just to wait until it comes closer to the contract expiration to I think the facility probably has to propose an extension, at which point Northwestern would engage in the appropriate time frame the extension of the contract, or actually it's a recalculation of the avoided costs. So does Northwestern proactively reach out to QS? I'm not aware of an instance that we've proactively reached out to them to renegotiate a contract. However, there's a big qualifier on that, and that in my history. So it's possible we have, but I don't have knowledge of it.
Very well. Admittedly, I also have a very short history in this field as well. But can you tell me, does Northwestern proactively reach out to other types of resources that are non-QF resources?
I'm trying to think of what that resource may be. Our portfolio consists of owned resources, contracted resources, QFs. I'm not aware of an example where we've proactively reached out to extend, in my short history, to extend a contract with a non-QF resource, although it is possible.
I'd like to move on then to some discussion of the Dave Gates Generating Station. As I understand it, the Dave Gates Generating Station has interruptible gas service. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Does Northwestern still consider Dave Gates Generating Station to be a firm resource?
Yes, according to the ELCC methodology, that's what was in the 2019 plan. And so that's the accredited capacity of that resource was assuming the ELCC methodology, and that would be a firm resource.
Okay. Does Northwestern consider it a firm resource because of its backup fuel supply?
No, it's that's not, it's the ELCC methodology is on a thermal facility like that. I believe it's the forced outage calculation methodology.
Would Northwestern then consider KELP to be a firm resource?
To the extent that it would, it's a thermal facility, so very much like the Dave Gates, yeah, it would be a firm resource in that regard, assuming it had a capacity that it would commit to.
The proxy expansion at Dave Gates Generating Station that Northwestern has proposed here, would it also have an interruptible natural gas supply?
Yes, the proxy that Northwestern used was the aeroderivative at Dave Gates with an interruptible gas supply. And it was a natural gas only generator because it was the least cost capacity proxy.
Does Northwestern then, or would Northwestern consider that proxy resource to also be a firm resource then in light of its interruptible gas supply and lack, as I understand it, of a fuel reserve?
Yes.
Okay. And could you explain to me how you make that determination?
So the word firm is essentially what capacity can we count on from the facility? And we count on the capacity that the facility provides according to, like, it's a forced outage calculation methodology. So it's firm in that sense that the presence of a dual fuel does not necessarily mean we can't count on the facility. So it still receives a capacity accreditation according to the ELCC methodology.
All right. So then, as I understand it, through that ELCC capacity accreditation, you can draw comparisons between generators that have firm fuel supplies and generators that have, let's say, interruptible fuel supplies.
Yeah, because my understanding, subject to check, is that it's based on the forced outages of the facility. And the forced outage, if perhaps the facility had a forced outage because there was no gas supply to it, that would affect the ELCC calculation of the facility. But if the facility has no forced outage as a result of a interruptible gas supply, say it was just offline for maintenance or something like that, that is a part of the forced outage calculation and the ELCC calculation of the facility.
Okay. Turning to something you mentioned in the cross-examination earlier this morning, you mentioned, I believe, in reference to exhibit MPG 8, which was the slide deck from Northwestern's Q3 of this year shareholder call, that it's important to distinguish between the sort of resource planning Northwestern does for QFs and the resource planning Northwestern does for all other sorts of resources. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
Am I understanding you correctly that there is a different process of resource planning for QFs than what you would plan on for all other resources?
What I'm referring to there is under the QF process, Northwestern assumes a facility into its resource stack. However, we don't know necessarily whether that resource will come to fruition. And so our capacity position will vary depending on whether or not those QFs actually come to fruition. So when we look at our need for capacity may be evaluated more on an immediate basis, because we recognize that what QFs come online is just an assumption, and we don't necessarily know if they actually will come online.
All right, so there's a risk involved with the QFs actually coming to fruition, as you say. There's also a risk, though, that other types of resources will not come to fruition. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's possible.
Do you also account for that sort of risk when you're assessing your plan for all those other resources?
Yeah, for example, we include a resource in our stack if it has a fully executed contract, for example, like the Yellowstone County Generating Station. We assume that in our resource stack. The important part about the QF process is that the QF process doesn't necessarily make judgments as to what's coming online or what may not come online. If that QF had shown that they've established site control, studied for interconnection, and so on, that they have to be considered in the resource stack, as opposed to when we look at our capacity planning as a whole, we recognize they might not come online, so we may have to take steps to become resource adequate.
It's true, though, that even a resource that you have a fully executed agreement for, that resource could not come online. There's still a risk involved there. Is that correct?
Yeah, until the resource achieves commercial operation, there's always some risk.
But do I understand you correctly that you still treat those sorts of resources differently in evaluating the risk than you do in evaluating the risk associated with a QF?
Because Northwestern really has no control whether the QF will actually go to construction and be built, there is necessarily a difference in the certainty of whether or not that resource will come to fruition, like the Yellowstone County Generating Station, for example, which has a fully executed contract and it's in construction. So there's just a different level of certainty that the facility will come online as compared to some of the QFs that may be in our queue.
All right. Finally, I'd like to turn to the issue of the step-up voltage, loss of energy during step-up voltage. Could you turn to, if you have it in front of you, the Kelp rebuttal exhibit MPG 9, which was included with Mr. Gorman's rebuttal testimony?
Okay, I'm there.
All right. And if you look at page 1, it's only a 2-page exhibit. Page 1 and line 1 describes the Yellowstone level revenue requirement. And there's a footnote associated with that line that says, see page 2 for the calculation of that. And have you reviewed this entire exhibit, including page 2, before today?
Actually, it was I have reviewed it, but there's another person that would probably give more direct testimony to point out the issues that are in this exhibit.
Who should I direct those questions to?
I believe it's Quinn McCarthy.
Quinn McCarthy. All right. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do have maybe a question or two. Mr. Schmidt, why does Northwestern Energy have this policy of waiting until 6 months before the contract expires before they will begin to negotiate a new contract?
Historically, Northwestern provided a fixed cost of energy for a QF. And as we know in the calculation of the fixed cost of energy, there are a lot of assumptions that going into making that calculation, including future power prices and gas prices and so on. And the farther out in the future you look, the more difficult it is to calculate an accurate fixed cost of energy. Now that may change potentially with the commission's preference to go to real-time pricing. However, there is another reason perhaps that any existing QF in our queue could theoretically look at its contract end date that is way out into the future and attempt to jump into our resource stack before it's really appropriate.
Thank you. Are there other terms of the contract that could be negotiated prior to that 6-month period? So that things are laid out and agreed upon so that once the cost is determined, that contract could be executed rather quickly?
Yes, perhaps there are other terms that, you know, Northwestern made mention that depending on the complexity of the issue, we may want to enter negotiations prior to 6 months to the contract termination.
Are there any other factors for why Northwestern has set this 6-month period besides the cost factor?
I think it just creates a procedural order and a process that Northwestern can follow. And it's something that is, I guess, workable from a procedural standpoint to understand how we should go about incorporating QFs into our queue and understand when they should be incorporated into our resource stack.
Are those the only two factors?
I think those are the most important factors, the timeliness and the accuracy of avoided costs. But again, because if we go to real-time energy prices, the uncertainty in the calculation of avoided energy costs could be minimized.
Okay. Does it have anything to do with this pressure that we're seeing, this trend in pressure that we're seeing for abandoning fossil fuel type energy sources?
We're certainly seeing a lot of interest in QF development in relation to a lot of different things that are ongoing out there right now, including the Inflation Reduction Act. So, you know, we expect that perhaps there could be a lot of activity of variable energy resources, and knowing the difficulty in developing thermal capacity. A lot of people in the industry are promoting variable energy resources as the answer, and that so we see interest in that regard, and a lot of people potentially lining up to develop variable energy resources.
Okay, so
On a regional basis, I'm considering that, you know, kind of from a regional basis.
okay. All right, I think that's all the further I'll go right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinochi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay that I skip follow-up and just ask some questions one after another.
Yes, please.
Okay, let's talk about dual fuel a minute. I was told that dual fuel is important because if the price of one fuel goes through the roof and the other one is a lot cheaper, then they can use a cheaper fuel, and that gives them the ability to be competitive. Is there some truth to that, or am I wrong?
Yeah, the fuel operating costs does play a factor in the overall cost of running the facility. So perhaps if the price of the fuel was low enough, the facility could potentially elect to use the alternate fuel.
Price of natural gas goes up in the winter time. It's pretty cheap in the summertime. Things like that. So let's ask this question. When you're dealing with kelp right now, if we were in another state, would Northwest Energy be handling this situation in another state the same? Or does Northwestern handle qualifying facilities differently in the application process? In other words, I haven't heard the attorney or kelp come out and say, wow, if we were in the next state, we'd be treated differently. Or is it, to your knowledge, treated the same from state to state?
My knowledge in that regard is limited, and that I understand we follow the process that is established in this state, and that other states have different processes. So I don't think I can really expound upon that.
I was listening to you very carefully, and I think you had a good point when you said, you know, the reason we want to make the deal later in the game, 6 months out, is we're trying to forecast the price of fuel, the price of this, the price of that. But what surprised me is I've been all over the United States listening to meeting after meeting where they're forecasting the price of electricity to go to an all-time high all across the country. Now, that would tell me I'd want to get with kelp a year ago or 6 months ago and lock in a really good price, because we know the prices are going up across the country. So wasn't there somebody forecasting that said, let's make a deal now before kelp might raise their price? Was that a consideration? Did anyone bring that up?
I think the Northwestern is in favor of doing real-time energy prices just because it's a way of making the customer indifferent to the QF. And there's a lot of uncertainty in future power prices. So I can't say that anyone at Northwestern looked at looking to secure a locked-in fixed energy rate for close to 20-year term was necessarily the most attractive option to keep customers indifferent to a QF.
I was at Hoover Dam the other day. It looks like there's a river on both sides of the dam. It's the lowest it's ever been in the history since they built it. That's telling me the price of electricity could get frightening. And they're telling me that's the situation with many dams in the United States, which is telling me the price of power is going up. That had to have been an indication, let's make a deal now. And it makes me nervous because when we raised the price of electricity, which we did $92 million a few weeks ago, I have to answer for that, right? So it makes me nervous that you're not working something out with kelp, because I do not want this plant to get locked up and shipped overseas where they feel that they get nervous, because then we've got to buy our power out of state at 10 times the price. You're making me nervous. Okay. So it's fair for me to say that. Okay. I'm concerned, but it has to be in the forecast that the price of energy is going up. I tell people, fill your propane tank outside your home in the middle of summer. Don't wait till winter. It's going to be a lot more expensive, right? So I want you guys to do the same thing, because I'm trying to look out for the ratepayer. Okay. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schmidt, you were asked by Council for Kelp about the RAP program and Northwest Energy's participation therein, and sort of the parameters of that program. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
So I believe you answered this question, but maybe I didn't understand what your answer was. So I'm just going to ask you a clarifying question that I'll term it. So has Northwestern decided or committed to join the binding phase of the RAP program? It was my understanding you said by the end of the year.
Northwestern expects to commit to the RAP program by the end of the year.
Okay. Are you familiar with the RAP program? I mean,
Yes, generally, yes.
would you be the correct witness to talk about that?
The intricate details of it would be for Quinn McCarthy.
Okay. All right. With that being stated, I'll withhold. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I have a series of questions, but one thing you made a comment, and again, as Commissioner Brown said, I may have misunderstood. I think you said that when Northwestern accepts more power from somebody than they expected, that it is disruptive to the system, or somehow it harms the system.
Yes, I'm not the best witness here to testify to that, but my general understanding is that when they exceed 35 megawatts, it can potentially create an imbalance on the system. And we have a upcoming witness that can testify better to what those operational issues are.
But thank you for that. And just a procedural thing in terms of mechanics that I don't know about, and maybe you know, if kelp is producing 42 and you're only set for 35, can you not accept that other 7, or alternatively, can kelp limit their production to just 35?
It's important from Northwestern's standpoint that whatever the maximum output of the facility is, just be defined in the LGIA so that we can study it and plan for it. Northwestern, is whatever that limit is, just needs to be planned and studied for so that we can take the correct actions under the LGIA to accommodate for that increased power. So under the existing PPA, Northwestern actually does not suggest a limitation to the megawatt hours of energy generated by kelp. It just because they're at the real-time price, as opposed to the other contract that had a fixed energy price, the old contract where we had a megawatt hour limitation on an annual basis. Northwestern and kelp, neither one suggests that there's a limit in the proposed PPAs to how many hours of energy they can generate.
Well, I'm just thinking, if it's disruptive to the system, why do they take that?
It can be accommodated for, from my understanding, although how exactly that works from an operational perspective, I can't attest to, but I understand that if they do increase their approved maximum under an LGIA, that can be accommodated for.
I noticed that Commissioner Fielder's question about the company might be treating this thing a little bit differently because it's a fossil fuel. I noticed that you did not give an answer to that. You talked about the regional, what's happening in the market, whatever, but you didn't give an answer to that. So I'll ask it perhaps a little bit more directly. It seemed to me that I recall a statement by the company sometime over the last few years that in order to reach its stated net zero pollution standards, that would require the non-participation of kelp and at least one other QF of similar vintage that is not part of the record, so I won't mention it. But it would seem to me that the company has a stake in not continuing on with kelp. Do you have any feeling about that?
I do. Under the net zero plan, Northwestern wants to be net zero by 2050, according to that plan, with no new fossil fuel generation being brought online after 2035. So to the extent that bringing the Kelp facility online at the end of the contract date and renewing a contract in 2024, that's not in conflict with Northwestern's stated net zero goal.
All right. Um, let's see, excuse me a moment. So the 6-month period has been discussed multiple times. It seems to me that what I read, Kelp's statement, is that waiting until 6 months before renewing the contract would put the continued operations of the company in great jeopardy. Employees might leave not knowing if they had any certainty. It would seem that the circumstances there are dramatically different from a regular QF that is going from the ground up because they haven't hired anybody yet. You know, that's in the future. And they're going to sign a 10, 15, 20-year contract, you know, for that, which gives some certainty to their operations. But given that this particular QF in this situation, I realize this renewing QFs like this is brand new territory. But it would seem to be convincing to me and Kelp's position that that is very unfavorable and maybe even fatal to their ability to operate in a renewed basis, even if it should occur because of the great disruption on that. How do you feel about their arguments along that line?
I understand Kelp's desire to get this contract in place beyond the 6-month limitation, and I would agree that it is appropriate that we are discussing a renewal of the PPA at this time, given Kelp's concerns of their employment. And at this point, we're 1.5 years out from the contract expiration. So to the extent that we can get this matter settled at this time is beneficial for Kelp.
Yeah, that was something that Council for Northwestern brought this up. He said that the discussion was that the company had Ms. Heim in particular, and then the letter from Bob Rowe said that Kelp was a valuable partner, but they didn't want to talk about it until 6 months. And then all of a sudden the company started negotiating. What happened, do you know, to change the company's view toward this?
Kelp sent the proposed PPA to Northwestern Energy, at which time Northwestern began reviewing it and contemplating what a return PPA proposal would look like, at which point Kelp filed with the commission, and then we entered into this procedural process.
Thank you. There was a document that was read from Northwestern Energy's comments having to do with resource adequacy and risk. And it seemed to be stated quite abundantly that it's a very challenging environment when what is referred to as baseload power is being curtailed within this region. It would seem to me from reading this and other statements the company has made is that they would be just thrilled to death to have a source of power that is much more firm than weather dependent facilities, generation facilities. But it seems to me from reading all this, the company is almost doing everything it can to not enter renegotiations and renewal of the contract. It seems totally discordant to me. Can you help me with that, please?
Northwestern wants the Kelp facility just at the right price. And that's what Northwestern is trying to achieve here is the customer indifference. And that's why the delay in waiting to enter into the turn of contract negotiations and calculating what it costs. So Northwestern appreciates the reliability of the kelp facility and the reliability that it can provide. Reliability is a very important thing for the company, for our customers, for our region. So to that extent, Northwestern is in favor of the kelp facility.
Let me take your first short statement on that and see if I can divide it up into two. You said Northwestern wants the kelp facility renewed at the right price. Can I cut that in half and say, does Northwestern want kelp to remain within its portfolio?
It's generally speaking, Northwestern just seeks the capacity that it needs to be resource adequate. As long as customers remain indifferent, Northwestern is totally amenable to kelp remaining as a power producer and selling to Northwestern Energy.
That certainly didn't answer my question, and I would say that customer indifference is only achieved at one particular moment in time because all of the factors are changing the very next day. So I can somewhat appreciate the company's statement that they didn't want to enter renegotiations until 6 months before because the data is going to be fresh at that point, is going to be more accurate. I understand that. However, it seems like the company is simply ignoring the real facts of dealing with this situation right here. And by doing that, said, this is our policy. Well, we can understand why this is a real problem in this case. And so if the company wanted to retain that baseload power, that they would be more accommodating that. It just seems like that to me. Am I wrong on that?
Northwestern has no pre-existing disposition against the kelp facility. So I just want to reaffirm that we just seek indifference for the customer in this case. We're not trying to discourage kelp, and we want to treat all our QFs the same.
Thank you for the answers. I find them to be not helpful at all for what I'm looking for, but thank you. So recross this time.
Thank you. No questions.
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Redirect.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Schmidt, is it realistic to assume that Northwestern would not join the RAP?
Northwestern is in the RAP and expects to participate in the next phase of the RAP.
And Northwestern fully expects to participate in the RAP at this time, right?
Yes, it does.
Is it realistic to assume that Northwestern wouldn't be a participant in the RAP throughout the entire term of KELP's proposed contract?
No, it's not realistic. Northwestern expects to be a participant throughout the entire term.
And opposing counsel talked to you about how KELP's proposal could allow it to provide capacity in the range of 22 to 42 megawatts in any given hour, so long as it meets its average commitment. Can you please describe how that would impact Northwestern's ability to plan?
When Northwestern is planning for peak capacity needs, we need to understand what capacity or resource will contribute at peak moments. And when there is a range of potential capacity being offered, it's difficult for Northwestern to count on, for example, 32 megawatts in the summer if the facility could realistically vary anywhere from 22 to 42 megawatts. It introduces an uncertainty into how much capacity we can count on for the KELP facility.
And under KELP's proposal, it would still receive a full capacity payment as long as it meets its proposed averages, right?
That's correct.
Under those averages proposals, is there any incentive for KELP to actually provide this a set amount of capacity?
During peak moments, no, as long as they're hitting the average, and they would, meet that contractual term. So there would be no incentive for kelp to be producing during the peak hours, that we needed them to be there at their full capacity.
And under Northwestern's proposal, using the RAP's rolling capacity accreditations, is Kelp incentivized to provide as much capacity as possible during peak hours?
Yes, they are, because under the RAP proposal, they would be encouraged to show up during the peak hours, when energy is in demand. They would also be economically incentivized, because theoretically during those peak hours, the price of energy would make it economical for kelp to operate.
Opposing counsel also talked about some of the contract provisions. Can you please explain the point of Northwestern's maximum output provision, which would limit kelp to 42 megawatts?
So there's two reasons for the maximum output provision. One is that so the facility, after we enter into a PPA, doesn't build on additional capacity, and then produce a lot more energy than was understood and pondered in the PPA. And then the second is also just to be in alignment with whatever the LGIA study is for the maximum amount of energy that can be put onto the system.
With respect to the mechanical availability portion, provision, sorry. You said that doesn't require kelp to operate, but just to be available. What incentivizes kelp to operate at max capacity?
Their capacity accreditation under the RAP would incentivize them to operate at max capacity. And because Northwestern's PPA has no limitation on the megawatt hours, kelp could theoretically maximize the output of the facility.
And opposing counsel also showed you a lot of data from prior years where kelp had exceeded its current capacity limit of 35 megawatts. Why did that data show kelp exceeded that limit?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
I believe it was based on all the data he just showed him that's in evidence.
In particular, the portion of the question that I object to is the council's statement that kelp exceeded its current maximum requirement.
I'll rephrase. So opposing counsel showed you prior year's data where kelp exceeded 35 megawatts. Why did that data show kelp exceeded 35?
They exceeded 35 because it was kelp was economically incentivized to produce as many megawatt hours of electricity as they could. It wasn't necessarily Northwestern calling upon them to go higher than 35.
And during those times when Northwestern had to purchase kelp's energy, during those times Northwestern had to purchase kelp's energy, is that right?
That's correct.
How did that affect Northwestern's ability to purchase cheaper energy on the market?
Because we had to purchase the kelp energy, if prices happen to be less on the market at that time, Northwestern would not have had the ability to buy on the market instead of purchasing the energy from kelp.
And those energy rates from kelp were fixed, right?
That's correct.
Opposing counsel also talked about the appropriate proxy. Can Northwestern avoid the costs of Yellowstone by purchasing from kelp?
No, the Yellowstone facility is under construction and will not allow Northwestern to avoid the cost of the Yellowstone facility.
Can Northwestern avoid the cost of building a 50 megawatt Arrow at DGGS by purchasing from kelp?
Potentially the avoided cost of the Arrow, that cost could be avoided. And that's why I argue that it is the least cost capacity resource as the appropriate proxy unit for calculating the capacity contribution.
And opposing counsel also talked about the fact that DGS, that particular unit, could, sorry. Opposing counsel also argued that DGS could be curtailed, so it's not an appropriate proxy. And he used an example about Winter Storm Uri. Was DGS curtailed during Winter Storm Uri?
No, I don't believe it was.
Has DGS been curtailed during any extreme weather event since 2014?
I don't believe it has.
Is an interruptible fuel supply similar to a fuel supply agreement where the buyer would assume the risk of inadequate fuel delivery?
Ask that again, please.
Is an interruptible fuel supply similar to a fuel supply agreement where the buyer would assume the risk of adequate fuel delivery?
In my opinion, that is roughly equivalent, which is why I suggest that the appropriate proxy unit is the natural gas only Arrow unit at Dave Gates.
And with respect to the Beartooth battery, as of April 29th, 2022, was Northwestern fully committed to the Beartooth battery?
Yes, it was.
As of April 29th, 2022, did Northwestern have a pre-approval application pending for the Beartooth battery?
I believe it did.
As of April 29th, 2022, had the pre-approval statute been rendered unconstitutional?
It had not.
What date does Northwestern use to calculate avoided costs for QFs?
We typically use the date that the facility demonstrates that it met the requirements to establish a LEO.
And if Northwestern acquires a resource after the QF established its LEO date, would that resource go ahead of the QF in the queue?
We look at the marginal addition of QFs, and the timing of when those QFs entered is based on when they file the permits and show site control, et cetera. So the timing of when those resources enter our queue is dependent upon those various factors that we've talked about.
Right. So after the LEOs, the QF establishes the LEO date, if any other resources come in, we don't put them ahead of the QF, right?
That's correct.
And so opposing counsel suggested that Northwestern could use RFPs to drive QF capacity payments to zero. Is that true after a QF establishes its LEO?
Ask that again, so I understand that.
So if Northwestern acquired resources in an RFP, but that occurred after a QF had already established its LEO, would that affect that QF's capacity payments?
No, because we take a snapshot in time of the resource stack when the LEO is established.
So is it fair to say that a LEO cuts both ways? Northwestern cannot include resources ahead of the QF after the LEO date, and also does not remove resources if they're no longer viable after the LEO date?
That is correct.
And was the Beartooth battery included in the Caithness portfolio that this commission previously approved?
I believe it was.
Can you please explain the differences between resource adequacy and avoided cost analysis?
Oh, that's a broad question.
I can break it up. Is for resource adequacy, do we take that as from a fixed point in time, like you would a QF analysis?
No, for resource adequacy, Northwestern's capacity position is frequently changing with the development of what resources may be expiring out of our queue or come online or come offline versus in the QF process. Once a LEO is established, we take a snapshot in time.
And can Northwestern control when a QF tenders the documents that are described in the commission's LEO rule?
No, that is up to the QF.
For avoided capacity analysis, why does Northwestern have to assume that QFs that have sent those documents in will come online?
Ask that again, please.
Yeah, for the avoided capacity analysis, why does Northwestern have to assume that the QFs that sent those documents into Northwestern that are now in the portfolio will come online?
Because that is the established process of this commission. So for capacity analysis, we look at the timing of when Northwestern can reasonably assume those QFs into our resource stack.
And if we didn't assume they come online, but they got legally enforceable obligation to come online at that date, if we don't include them, will multiple QFs be receiving the benefit of the same incremental capacity?
Yes, that would be the result if we don't keep track of the order of when QFs are taking incremental or fulfilling incremental capacity needs in Northwestern's system. The potential is if we got those out of order, that customers would pay avoided cost of capacity rates for the same increment to multiple QFs. So that's the danger of that.
Would that be harmful to customers?
Yes, it would, in that they're double paying for capacity.
Is it fair that CALP's proposal where they want 403 megawatts of those pending QFs to be removed from the portfolio? Is it fair to say that they're fighting for those same incremental capacity that those other QFs have essentially claimed?
Yes, they would be. It would be problematic, in my opinion, to establish KELP's position ahead of when those other QFs met all the requirements for establishing site control and being studied as for interconnection and submitting a unilaterally signed PPA and so on.
And with respect to the 2020 RFP where the Yellowstone County Generating Station was selected, was that an RFP solely to determine avoided cost of capacity?
That's an important distinction, that the RFP had a variety of requirements for the resource that would be selected. It would be a mistake to assume that it was strictly to establish an avoided cost of capacity.
And with respect to the future RFPs that opposing counsel was alluding to, could KELP submit a bid into those future RFPs if it doesn't like the rates that this commission provides it?
It could.
And I just want to make something abundantly clear here. From questions of Commissioner O'Donnell and Pinocci, it seemed like they may have believed that Northwestern would be opposed to contracting with KELP. Is Northwestern opposed to contracting with KELP as long as it's avoided costs rate, as long as it's at accurate avoided costs and KELP follows our interconnection procedures?
Absolutely not.
And did Northwestern treat KELP differently because it's a fossil fuel resource?
No, we attempt to treat all QFs the same.
And you reviewed a lot of letters this morning. In any of those letters, did KELP request Northwestern to provide a calculation of Northwestern's avoided costs?
No, they did not.
KELP claimed that Northwestern alluded in response to those letters that it would not provide that calculation until closer to the contract termination date. Is that accurate?
Yes.
KELP's counsel asked whether a layperson would feel inhibited from requesting an avoided cost calculation based on Northwestern's responses. Did Northwestern send that letter to someone that wouldn't know how to read the commission's rules?
Presumably the receiver of those letters would have been able to understand the intention of those letters and what was in them and how to interpret them.
Who did Northwestern send those letters to?
Mr. Orndorfer, as I understand it.
And were you in the room when Mr. Orndorff testified yesterday?
Yes, I was.
Did you hear what he said his occupation was?
Yes, he's a lawyer.
If KELP would have requested Northwestern's calculation of avoided costs under the commission's rules, would Northwestern have provided it?
Yes, it would have.
Would it have needed KELP's resource information in order to do that?
Very likely it would have, because for fixed energy rates, we need certain resource characteristics to understand how to calculate the fixed energy price for avoided cost.
Did Kelp provide any of that information we would have needed?
No, they did not.
Did Northwestern request that same information from Kelp in this docket?
Yes, we did.
Was Kelp reluctant to provide it?
Yes, they were.
Did Northwestern have to file a motion to compel just to get that information from Kelp?
I understand they did.
And if Kelp would have submitted all the documents referenced in the commission's LEO rule, would Northwestern have put Kelp in his portfolio sooner?
Yes, it would have.
An opposing counsel suggested that one of those items, the permits, shouldn't have been required because it was an existing facility, right?
Correct.
Do existing facilities permits change over the years?
Objection. This goes beyond the scope of cross. When I asked this witness questions about that, counsel objected. Those objections were sustained, and this area of inquiry was not covered in cross. Therefore, I object both that it's beyond the scope and beyond this witness's expertise based on his own counsel's representations.
That's not my recollection of how that transpired. But the changing, the fact that permits change is already an exhibit that's been entered into this record. So for briefing purposes, I'll just refer to those. And did Northwestern know whether Kelp was occupying its current site through a lease or through a deed?
I did not have any knowledge. I don't believe Northwestern had knowledge of whether or not they were leasing or on deeded land or one way or the other.
If it was through a lease, wouldn't it have been important for Northwestern to know that it would have site control after that lease expired?
Objection calls for legal conclusion.
Asked whether it was important for them to know whether the Kelp facility would have a lease for its operations post June 30th, 2024. I don't believe that's a legal conclusion.
If I may, my understanding of counsel's question is that it was important in the context of his line of questionings, which is to establishing a LEO. If the importance is for something other than establishing a LEO, I would ask the commission to ask counsel to rephrase the question.
Well, I said the question. I didn't say anything about a LEO when I asked the question.
Yeah, I'll override the objection. Go ahead.
Can you ask it again?
I believe I asked if it's important for Northwestern to know whether, if Kelp did have a lease, whether it was important for Northwestern to know that it would have extended that lease over the course of its proposed contract term.
It is important to know that because without understanding that, Northwestern does not understand if the facility has site control.
And until Kelp produced those documents in discovery, Northwestern didn't have any documents reflecting Kelp site control, right?
That's correct.
And when Kelp submitted a unilaterally signed PPA on April 29th, 2022, did Northwestern put Kelp in the portfolio?
Yes, that is the time that Northwestern assumed them into the portfolio.
And did Northwestern ever contest Kelp's claimed LEO date of April 29th, 2022, after it sent that unilaterally signed PPA?
No, we do not contest that.
In all those prior letters, until the April 29th letter, was Kelp proposing a fixed avoided cost payment?
I'm not I'd have to review all the letters to understand the proposal, but Kelp was proposing a renewal of the existing contract.
Yeah, and under its existing contract, those were fixed rates, right?
Correct.
And I believe, can you please explain to the commission why trying to figure out fixed rates years in advance is problematic?
Calculating a fixed rate of energy years in advance takes into account a number of projections of future prices, future power prices, future gas prices, potential resource costs, and that kind of thing. So it becomes problematic the further out you look.
And when Kelp finally offered variable rates in that April 29th, letter, did Northwestern advise that it would start negotiating with Kelp?
At that time, Northwestern looked at Kelp's proposal and began pondering what a counter PPA proposal would be. And Northwestern was in favor of variable energy rates being real-time rates.
And then one more question. Commissioner O'Donnell was asking you questions about the operational issues created by Kelp exceeding 35 megawatts. Who's the appropriate witness for those questions?
I believe it's Mr. Powers.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're finished with this witness. You are temporarily excused. Mr. Hensley?
Northwestern would like to call Mr. Quinn McCarthy.
And Mr. McCarthy was sworn in.
I believe so. Let me confirm.
I believe so. With a name like McCarthy, he's got to be trustworthy. He's just, excuse me for my Hibernian roots. Go ahead. Proceed.
Mr. McCarthy, can you please state and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is Quinn McCarthy, Quinn McCarthy.
And Mr. McCarthy, by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what's your position at Northwestern?
I'm a markets and optimization analyst.
And did you file pre-filed direct testimony in this matter?
I did.
And is that testimony in front of you?
It is.
And if I asked you those same questions today, would the answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Do you have any corrections to make?
I do not.
At this time, I'd like to offer Mr. McCarthy's testimony into the record as Northwestern Exhibit 1.
Objections?
Or sorry, Northwestern Exhibit 2.
Okay. Oh, that's correct.
No objection.
Great. So ordered.
And I'd open up for cross.
Mr. Chairman, I had a discussion with the witness and counsel for Northwestern. One of the areas that I intend to explore with Mr. McCarthy is his exhibit QMM1, which is a large electronic spreadsheet. And I had made a request of the commission to consider the possibility of figuring out how to pull that spreadsheet from the commission's records and post it in the room somewhere so that people could see what we were discussing in the course of the cross-examination. And so before I commence, can I just make an inquiry of yourself and the staff as to whether that can in fact be accommodated? And if so, can we get that queued up so that we're ready to go before I commence?
Before, I'd just like to clarify, I have no problem if he's going to walk him through the spreadsheet and ask him what particular numbers say. But I would be opposed to him asking the witness to conduct a new analysis and present new evidence on cross-examination. So I guess I need to know the intent.
I don't intend to have him recalculate the spreadsheet. I just want to document the numbers that are on the chart, which happens to be a spreadsheet.
And that's fine. Again, as long as they're not changing any numbers around or anything like that, I'm okay with that.
Mr. Chairman, I believe staff is able to accommodate the request to display the spreadsheet. To be clear, should that spreadsheet also be broadcast as part of the live stream on the commission's website?
Yes, it surely can. There's nothing, as I understand it, although counsel and witness, correct me if I'm wrong, there's nothing confidential on that spreadsheet. So it can absolutely go as part of the live stream as well as to the persons who are participating remotely.
Very well. In that case, if we could take just a brief recess in order to get that set up.
Fine, we're off the record and for a few minutes until that's done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.